So now we're going to look at composite functions. So we'll look at two functions. One we'll call f of x. And we'll say f of x is x squared. And the other function we'll call g of x. And we'll name them f and g just to distinguish that they are two different functions. And g of x will be the square root of x plus 1. So now, one thing we can do is we can say, what is f of x plus g of x? We can combine those two functions by addition. So all I'm going to do is simply, in place of f of x, I'm going to use x squared. So that's x squared. And then, in place of g of x, I'm going to use square root of x plus 1. And I'm going to add it because that's what I'm doing. And that's it. We can actually graph that in our calculator or do more with it, all right? We want to look, one thing we want to do is we want to realize, so the composite function still has a domain. You know, we're always going to look at domain. And in this case, for domain, we can't take the square root of a negative number, so that number has to be greater than or equal to 0. So I'm going to say x plus 1 greater than or equal to 0, x has to be greater than or equal to negative 1, and an interval notation is from negative 1 all the way up to infinity is my domain. Okay. One thing you may see is instead of f of x plus g of x, they may write down f plus g that way of x, but it means the same way. You're adding two functions. Okay. Continuing on. Okay. How about if I asked you for f of x minus g of x? I think you can do the same thing here. In place of f of x, I use the x squared. So that's x squared minus, and instead of g of x, I'm going to use square root of x plus 1. So square root of x plus 1. And the same thing, you can figure out the domain. Continue, and we can write that as f minus g of x. You may see that notation. Okay, continuing on, let's rewrite f of x equals x squared, g of x equals the square root of x plus 1. Okay, if we can add and subtract, we can also multiply. So I could see f of x times g of x, or you may see f times g of x. And all that means is, once again, I substitute x squared for f of x plus 1 for g of x, and I'm finished. And once again, we can look at the domain. And the last one we'll do is f of x divided by g of x, or you may see the notation f divided by g of x, which is no more than f of x, which is x squared, over the square root of x plus 1. Now one thing we have to note here is we still have the same restriction that we can't take the square root of a negative number, or that number has to be greater than or equal to 0. But now, since we've placed the function g of x in the denominator, we've got to consider that number cannot be 0. So before, our domain was x plus 1 had to be greater than or equal to 0, but now our domain is x plus 1 has to be greater than 0. Can't be equal to, because if it was equal to, we'd be divided by 0. So x greater than negative 1, or in interval notation, open circle or open parentheses from negative 1 to positive infinity.